are the historical books different? And if you just thought, wait, what? They're different? I mean, they're all the books of the Bible. It's all the Old Testament, right? It's kind of like Where's Waldo? I mean, I know the books are sort of different. Like, I know not everything or person in this picture is Waldo, but I don't see enough differences to be able to find it. Well, hopefully this video will help you out. First off, when we say history books, we're really talking about the books that pick up from the point that Israel is finally about to enter into the Promised Land. Technically, yes, the Old Testament, it's all history. But from Genesis up until this point, it's about God's creation and His dealings with Israel. Deuteronomy, which is the last book of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, brings us to this point that begins to record the nation's history. And so we're talking Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. We'll look at what's in them, how we can interpret them, the theological themes, and finally, how we can apply them to our Christian lives today. Okay, so what is in them? History. Okay, serious. Real quick, Joshua is about Israel's conquest, for the most part, of the Promised Land. The land is divided between the 12 tribes of Israel, and toward the end of the book, we start to see the consequences of not completing the conquest as God had told them to. Judges picks up from the death of Joshua and records that time of national decline in the nation's history, whereas verse 17:6 says, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The pattern in Judges that God's people abandon Him, God punishes them by sending a foreign power to oppress them. They cry out for help, and then He raises up a deliverer or a judge. And then lather, rinse, repeat. Ruth is in this time frame, and it's an incredible story of God's sovereignty and providence in history. And out of the family line of the union between Ruth and Boaz comes none other than Jesus Christ. 1st and 2nd Samuel picks up from Judges, as Samuel is the last of Israel's judges. And this ushers in Israel's monarchy with a guy named Saul. At first, everybody is all excited to have a king, but his reign ends in disaster. And God turns over the kingdom to a more familiar name, King David. And he finally, imperfectly, but finally finishes the conquest as God had commanded them of Canaan. Kings is about David's son, Solomon, mostly in his reign, and the downhill spiral of the nation after his death. The kingdom splits into 2. The northern kingdom, Israel, abandons God, and God sends the Assyrians to conquer them and take them into exile. Judah, the southern kingdom, fares a little bit better, lasts a few more generations, but ultimately they go the same path, and God sends the Babylonians to conquer them and take them into exile. Chronicles covers much of the same history, but it's told a little bit differently and for different purposes. Ezra and Nehemiah, we pick up from the end of the exile, and as God's people return from Babylon to what used to be Judah, they begin to start over. Esther is another great book, but this one's different because it's told from the perspective of those that did not return to Judah. And it is about God's sovereignty and active involvement in history, even though His name is never mentioned, as He protects His people from Persian persecution. So how do we interpret them? They're written thousands of years ago in a culture most of us can't even imagine. Most of us can't even imagine life before cell phones and social media. First, we have to wrestle with the fact that this is a very unique genre. It's unique because there is no other civilization in the ancient Near East that recorded such a comprehensive history. It's also unique because most of us think of history in modern terms as a simple compilation of facts in chronological order without any editorial bias. But turns out there really is no such thing as a historical account without some amount of bias. Everyone's telling a story. But these men, these authors, were inspired by the Holy Spirit. They wanted to show how God was actively involved in shaping history in His sovereign control over the people, the places, and the events in order to make it happen. It is God's revelation. And these guys used every literary device that we know of to tell the story. They used biographies, parables, lists, oracles, taunts, proverbs, letters, and the list could go on and on. And so we need to think of genre. And then context, religion, history, geography, politics, economics, the cultures. These all provide the contextual details to help understand the world around the author and his intended audience. So how would they have understood it? Context. Eugene Merrill has some excellent questions that, by asking, helps us interpret these historical books. Why did the author write it? What was his purpose? What was he trying to communicate to his audience? Purpose. And since it's a historical narrative, it's a story. It's not just facts written down. What is the plot of the story? Who are the characters? How are these characters interacting with each other, and how are they interacting with God? We need to look at the author's meaning. And then he has some cautions to help with interpretation. First, he says, don't assume that what's in a historical narrative is prescriptive. There are, that's right, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so we need to look and be aware of the author's intent. And then don't be like me and get so focused or confused with the details that you miss the main point of the story. The proverbial missing the forest for the trees kind of thing. So focus on the story. And then lastly, don't try to force an application out of every text. There might not be one. It may only be supporting a larger narrative. So my professor, Dr. Meek, says, we need to remember that these were not written to us, but they were written for us. Some of the theological themes are God's faithfulness to His promises, His sovereignty over history, His power to turn what looks like certain defeat and disaster and turn it into triumph. We see His justice and His providence. And then finally, how do we apply these historical books? Carefully. We need to keep in mind the potential pitfalls and then look for the enduring principles in these narratives, because they include characters that are struggling with life in a fallen world just like we are. And in these books, as Merrill says, there is no better teacher than history for such cause and effect topics as sin and its punishment and obedience and its blessedness. I hope that helps.